Hello and welcome to another instalment of History Hack. Alina, who have you gone and found for us today?
We've got with us Kelsey Power, who is a PhD student at King's College London. She's currently working on prisoners of war during the Napoleonic period, specifically the British in France and honour. Welcome, Kelsey.
Hello.
This is great. I love this concept of honour among prisoners. And I've got some guys I research in World War One who are interned in Holland, and they're given leave. They're allowed to go home on leave as long as they promise to come back, because
Wow.
it dictates that you have to do that if you said you would. I would be like, yeah, sure, I'll do that, and then they wouldn't see me for dust. But
Yeah, me too.
this existed. So I guess first of all, Kelsey, can you set the scene for us during the Napoleonic War? Why are there so many prisoners of war?
So it's actually kind of an interesting change from what was like normally happening. So prior to the Napoleonic Wars, it was kind of like standard that prisoner exchanges would happen quite frequently, right? You would be captured and then you would be exchanged for somebody of equal rank. And there are cases of that taking, as short as like 2 weeks kind of thing. But when Napoleon kind of comes to power and the Peace of Amiens kind of dissolves, Napoleon kind of changes the rules a little bit. So he decides that instead of regularly exchanging prisoners, he's just going to hold them. And in addition, he also kind of decides that all of the British people currently in France who had come flooding back during the peace, right? They'd eagerly come back to France to try and reestablish, like trade relations, or to, get back to go to the theater, or, buy the most fashionable clothing, or, do their, nice tour of Europe. They kind of get rounded up and declared as prisoners of war, even though they're civilians, under the sort of maybe kind of fake reasoning that they could be enlisted in the militia in England. So you have a large group of civilian prisoners of war, and then a large group of sort of like naval prisoners of war, and they are held instead of being exchanged for the duration of the war.
I was not expecting you to say that normal civilians are being rounded up and put in. I can't understand this. I mean, I understand it, but I can't understand it at the same time.
Yes, I mean, some of them had like properly moved to France. There's one account written by a he'd been working sort of in politics and stuff, and he was talking about how like some of the people had been like French citizens. They'd been living in France for, some of them 20 years and had families and jobs, and suddenly they're deemed like, oh, you're British now. And therefore, you have to move into this prisoner of war depot.
It's sadly not an isolated event in history, is it? Suddenly deciding that, you have with the Japanese in Canada and America in World War II as well. So where did they keep them? You mentioned depots.
Yes. So France actually was really lucky compared to other places. They had established kind of places where they could keep prisoners of war. So they had a host of kind of fortified strong places on what was at the time French border, established during the 1700s by a architect named Vauban. And so these are names that are probably famous just generally, right? Verdun, Metz. These are strongholds that become famous again during World War I because they're easy to defend, and they just shuffled all the prisoners into these castles, I guess, almost, and into the towns surrounding them.
I'm really stuck in the 20th century, so you're going to have to tell me what these living conditions are like for them.
So that really depends on a couple of factors. The first mainly being whether or not they're an officer and therefore a gentleman, or if they're a detainee, right, one of these civilians who were detained, or if they're part of like the merchant fleet, because there's some confusion really with the French over who kind of constitutes someone who's honorable and therefore gets to live on parole, and someone who isn't. So what you see is they take all of the officers, and most of them end up in Verdun, which is kind of like the place where most of the civilian detainees end up as well. Some of them get like special permission to live in like Paris and stuff, but the bulk of the detainees, with very few sort of special cases, end up in Verdun, and this is like the privileged depot. And most of these prisoners get to live on parole, which means that instead of living in the actual, like citadel, they get to live in the town. They get to find their own lodging. They get to sort of travel within like 10 miles of the depot. And they start kind of creating their own society that mimics British society. So they have gambling and horse races. They do horse races. They have libraries. They start a school for navigation and learning French. Some of them are taking dancing. They have gentlemen's clubs. I don't know if I mentioned that already. Yes, they have gentlemen's clubs. And so they kind of like, hold dinners, go to balls, same as they would in privileged society in England. And then below that, or kind of adjacent to that, you have merchant captains. And the way that the French kind of divided this up was that if you were a captain of a ship that was greater than 60 tons, then you got to be like a gentleman. You were properly, important enough to give your parole. But if you captained a ship that was less than that, then you got sort of shuffled off with all of the, like riffraff, normal sailors and things. And so the normal sailors, they get to live within the citadels. And they have, ones that are kind of like devoted specifically to those kinds of prisoners, right? And so there's this really like huge divide kind of between the way that prisoners kind of experience their incarceration, depending on whether or not they were considered, honorable enough.
Is there an evolution in the status of prisoners of war throughout the Napoleonic Wars?
That's difficult to track, partially because the prisoners, when they're writing, they actually don't usually write down very well, like what time or what year they're writing in, and I think that's kind of understandable considering we're all in lockdown right now, and you kind of like lose track of what day it is. But also they had very limited access to things like newspapers. There were periods where they were not permitted to receive or send letters. So the normal ways of like keeping time make it a little bit difficult to very specifically kind of take, like, oh, this bit where you're talking about, being imprisoned, or this bit where you're talking about trying to escape, or this bit where you're being treated really well. Unless they really, do a good job of bookmarking that. It's hard to pinpoint that as a, oh, in 1803, it's very different from like 1813. Mostly the big change is pre-1803, and then after 1803, there's this, huge kind of like change. But they continue to try and arrange sort of like trading prisoners back and forth for several years after that, but it never quite works out, unfortunately.
I've been given a French word, so I really do apologise if I do pronounce it wrong, so please can somebody correct me. So I'll go for the question, and then when I pronounce it wrong, you can either laugh at me or correct me, take your pick. So can you define for us the terms prisoners, detenius, parole? I don't know.
I mean, I'm probably pronouncing it incorrectly with my, gauche American accent, but I just say detainees. And it just means detained. And
Do you know
so
what
prisoners.
parole is, Alina?
No, I know, but I know what parole is, but but now I know it means detained. It makes so much more sense.
Yeah. So I mean, there's a little bit of distinction between prisoners and detainees, right? Sometimes there's a huge distinction that they themselves make, and sometimes they just all get classed as prisoners. So prisoners of war is a like legal term that has legal standing. You are a member of an armed force. You've been captured. You have rights, basically. And the British government will negotiate with the French government during this time in order to make sure that you get, you get paid during the time. You get like an allowance. You are being granted more privileges, and like people know what to expect from you. They can talk to somebody who's in charge. They can refer back to the British Admiralty if they have a problem. So there's a real sort of like connection between the French government and the British government that means that these people have like real protections and legal standing. Detainees, on the other hand, right, the detained, these are the civilians, and completely unprotected in a lot of ways. They're left on their own. They don't get this minimum payment of oh, you're part of the armed forces. So they're left paying their own way and supporting themselves, which is quite difficult because some of them are very wealthy and some of them are really, really not. And then parole. Parole is basically means or translates to word of honor. And so you see that nowadays in like the prison system, right? Somebody who is given parole is kind of given the privilege to leave the prison early, provided, of course, that they don't commit any more crimes. I'm sure that there are going to be a number of criminologists and prison studies people who are going to take issue with that definition, but
but that's your definition and you stick to it.
Yes. So what's interesting about parole is this like part about honor, right? So only the people who are considered honorable are allowed to give their parole. And in this time, the people who are considered honorable are the people who are members of the aristocracy who already have privilege.
Let's get to the point of your research, which is honor and the concept of honor. What does it mean during this period?
So honor is really interesting, again, because it is this sort of like very privileged kind of concept. It's expanding at this time period. We kind of think of honor as being, okay, you're in the aristocracy, therefore, you're defending your privileges. You're, conducting duels. If somebody insults you, you're gonna, fight over it. And at this time period, it's expanding. So it's also encompassing sort of like commercial people, and everybody's got like a very different understanding of what honor entails, right? And that's one of the interesting things about prisoners of war and honor is that they're fighting over what is the appropriate honorable behavior, because they have such a wide spectrum of people who are being imprisoned, from the Army, from the Navy, who both have different ideas of honor, civilians who have a specific kind of honor, kind of like fighting over, what are we supposed to do when we're suddenly being imprisoned for a really long time, which we've never had to deal with before. How do we navigate this problem?
Why were POWs using honor instead of duty at this time?
So honor is a less kind of like professionalized way of enforcing kind of social behaviors, right? We kind of think about honor now as a very specific thing, usually related to like honor killings. But at the time, honor is like proto-professional. It's grounded in the military. And this is because the aristocracy is historically like the group that is in charge of the military. So courage is important. Willingness to sacrifice your life for reputation is important. But these things like marked people out as trustworthy and as like worth following into battle.
Yeah.
Duty, on the other hand, seems to be kind of a more professionalized way of describing it, right? If you're a member of a profession, if you're part of the Navy, then you have specific a specific job to do and specific expectations, and these are usually laid out in rules and things. And so POWs are using honor because the people who are in charge are the aristocracy, and they're the ones who are concerned with honor. When you see the discussion mention duty, it's usually in response to lower class prisoners of war. So the upper class prisoners, right, the officers, right, when they talk about, should we do this, should we not do this, what is appropriate behavior, they are always using the language of honor. But when they talk about, say lower class prisoners defecting and joining the French Navy, then they will pull out the language of duty to say, these people have a duty to their king. But they don't grant them that, privilege of honor because they're not of the upper class. So really, like when we talk about honor for prisoners of war, the reason why they're talking about it as honor is because the people who are in charge are most concerned with that as the higher standard of behavior.
How did honor manifest in such a male-dominated space?
So it's interesting because for one thing, it's not quite probably as male-dominated a space as you might think. A lot of these prisoners, because some of them were civilians, they had their families with them, or they, married French women, or they brought their family over from Britain to live with them after they realized they weren't going to be exchanged. So actually, you see that they're not quite as male dominated as say actually being on board of a ship. But you also see that like honor manifests in some interesting ways. For instance, dueling, something that you wouldn't think that prisoners of war would be allowed to participate in. But actually Napoleon he carved out a specific exemption for prisoners of war because dueling was not legal in France at the time. But the prisoners specifically appealed to Napoleon, and he said, yes, British prisoners may duel with each other, and in fact duel with French people. So you see some instances where people are called out and they'll actually fight. Where they get the weapons, I don't know. But
so they were dueling with each other. I mean, did people die from this?
Yes, yeah. Actually, dueling happened a lot. A number of prisoner accounts will mention just how frequently dueling happened. They're disappointed in their fellows for dueling so frequently, and they think it's they mostly ascribe part of the problem to like boredom and the fact that you have a bunch of people from different classes thrown together and whatnot. But it's things like this person is decided to exclude me from the gentleman's club that I want to join, so I'm going to challenge him to a duel, or that sort of thing.
So they could be that petty that, I just got excluded, let's duel.
Oh, it's more petty than that.
I suppose if you've got nothing else to do.
Yes, indeed, right. There are instances of duels. One prisoner talks about how he had a duel with his best friend over an argument about who had the best dinner in London. So,
Alex, I don't like you right now. Let's
Oh
duel.
my god, we would have duelled each other like 3,000 times if we were that petty.
Oh, please, can we, next time I'm in London, can we duel, please, just for fun? But not with real swords, because we might kill each other. But
So like, no, it's guns, isn't it? So a potato
oh, yeah.
gun or a water pistol.
it is guns, yeah.
Okay,
Which is interesting. Like, why do they have guns? Who's been carrying dueling pistols with them all the way from the
And
coast?
hasn't tried to use them to shoot your captors and run away.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh. No, this is it. We're dueling with can we duel with both swords and guns?
Oh, how do you want to duel with a sword? Because you walk away from each other, then turn round. Are you going to throw it at me?
And we're gonna run at each other like, Braveheart.
We discussed yesterday on Down the Pub that they didn't have those swords in
I know.
Braveheart times. It was a lie.
But
Mel Gibson
indulge me.
lies.
Indulge me in my weird imagination.
I
Sorry.
indulge you more than enough. Kelsey, why is honour so important?
Honestly, it's a way for the prisoners to kind of protect themselves. There's no sort of legal precedent at this time to sort of say, okay, this is how you treat prisoners of war. I mean, there are discussions for a long time, but they're not enshrined in like an international legal code. It's just, this is what the tradition is. This is what all quote unquote civilized countries have kind of agreed to over time. So honor is a way for prisoners to kind of like assert their humanity and their privileges, right?
So were there any escapes? And how does honor fall into all of this?
Yes, so they're kind of faced with the first time with this idea of escape, right? Because if exchanges are occurring regularly, which prior to 1803 they were, escape doesn't really become necessary. You just wait it out. But suddenly these people are, constantly, being let down by this idea that like, oh, I'm going to be exchanged, and then it doesn't happen. And so they start to contemplate escape. And they have to figure out when that's appropriate. So parole, right? The parole promise that they're giving in order to live in the town is that they won't attempt to escape for as long as their captor doesn't keep them quote unquote closely confined. And close confinement meant being kept within the citadel, right? So if you were living in the town, you were using your parole privileges, and therefore it was inappropriate for you to attempt to escape. But if you broke the rules enough, you could have your parole privileges revoked, and then you would be kept in the citadel. And there are some like quibbles over like, if you're just kept in the guardhouse, does that constitute enough, citadelness to mean that your privileges have been truly revoked, or do you need to wait until you're properly put in the dungeon part of it? And then there are, of course, like difficulties about, these different ideas of honor, right? So the army has a different idea of honor, the Navy has a different idea of honor, and civilians have a different idea of honor. So civilians don't have a, strict idea of when their parole privileges are being revoked. So a lot of them just kind of escape without having their parole privileges taken from them. And that causes a little bit of trouble. So there are a few like fun ones that I wanted to talk about.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So there's one case of two detainees who escaped, and everybody is issued with a passport, right? This has their name and their ages and where they're from if they want to travel through France. And what this couple does is they have a passport for just the wife, right, Georgiana, because women tended to have free movement, whereas the men did not. And what they do is they alter the passport for her so that it says George and Anna, and then hire a coach and just like travel out of the country. There's also a case of a man named Sir Beaumont Dixie, which is just a great name. I'm in love with that name.
Yeah, it's pretty cool.
But he ran into trouble because he was detained as a civilian, a detainee, and he had previously been a naval officer, but he'd unexpectedly inherited. He was like the younger brother, and his older brother passed away, and so he inherited the title and left the Navy. So he tried to escape by going on a picnic. This was like a frequent thing that people did. They would go on picnics and go swimming. And he stripped off all of his clothes, left them on the bank of the river to go swimming, and then just like swam away with the idea that
See, I would do something like this. Screw honor. I don't want to be in jail.
Well, yes, that's the thing, is that he was hoping that everybody would think that he drowned, and he told some of his friends that, you know, spread this idea that I drowned. But some of the naval officers, kind of like the captains in Verdun, heard about this, and they were like, no, you were a former naval officer, and that is too close to being an actual naval officer. So they reported him to the general in charge of the depot, and they recaptured him.
Oh no! I was hoping you would say that he made it and he got to No.
Unfortunately, he got sent to the imprisonment, the like prisoner, like the punishment depot, called Bish, and he ended up staying a long time in the dungeons there, but did eventually make it out.
I love it. Have you got any other escape stories for us? Everybody loves a good escape story.
I love a good escape story.
Yeah.
So my personal favorite is this case of a midshipman called Edmund Temple, and he's not popular among the other prisoners, and that's for a few reasons. He's kind of snooty, but also he gets into considerable debt. So there's a gambling den in Verdun that is open specifically to British prisoners of war. They don't want the French people going in there, and it's to, you know, make money off of the British prisoners, right? They lose all of their money, and then the French people get to keep it. But he gets in debt to this man named Balby, who is a loan shark. Basically, he owns the gambling den and then moves into loan sharking. And there's some discussion at the time about whether or not debt to British debt can be reclaimed or not. Are they able to kind of are they allowed to be imprisoned for debt, right? Just as, like they would be in England if they don't pay their debts. And so he interprets this idea that he might be imprisoned for not paying his debts as a breaking of the parole promise, right? They're going to like properly imprison him, and he's not going to have access to, living on the town anymore. So that means he's allowed to escape. Unfortunately, nobody in the British, Navy kind of agrees with him. But what he does is he gets his then girlfriend, gosh, I forget her name, but she and him organize their escape together. So she hires a coach. They build a sort of like secret compartment under the floor of the coach, and then just kind of like walk out of the town. He hides in the bottom of the coach, and she sits on top of it, and they just drive out.
It's so simple. How do you get yourself, if you're already in jail, you're already in a pretty dire situation, do you end up getting yourself into more trouble with a loan shark? You've got to be a bit of a div, haven't you?
Yeah, I mean, it's the sort of thing. There a lot of the people who get in debt are either because they don't have very much money to begin with,
Mm.
and they're being extorted by their landlords, or the general in the depot, Wirion, is actually constantly being put down in all of the prisoner of war narratives about just how terrible he is, because he will charge them excessive amounts of money for pretty much anything,
Yeah.
really. So they're paying a considerable amount of money to live on parole. But then you also have people who are just bored, right? They don't have anything else to do. They're young and they don't understand credit. They don't understand the things that they're signing, and they're just gambling with their friends because that's what wealthy young men do. And then suddenly they're 3,000 pounds in debt to somebody who
Daddy's not there to pay the bill.
Yeah.
When does this idea of honour, when does this start to wane? Because there is a little bit of it about the First World War. I did find those Dutch prisoners, they were part of the naval contingent that turned the wrong way and ended up interned way at the beginning of 14. And the officers were put in, basically they lived in like halls of residence at, I think it's Groningen Uni, for the whole war. And they were allowed home on leave as long as they promised to come back. But when does this, it's definitely gone by World War II, hasn't it?
Yeah, I think that's really when it kind of disappears. I don't know if you've seen the film La Grande Illusion.
No.
Okay, it's a film about World War I and prisoners of war, and it's like gorgeous. It's a gorgeous film. But part of the premise is this huge difference between the prisoners who are part of the aristocracy and the prisoners who aren't. So there's a whole plot point about one of the wealthy prisoners, like his German captor, right? They're like, we have more in common with each other as being part of this aristocratic class than you have with your countrymen, your French countrymen. And he kind of, like, the French aristocrat eventually rejects that and helps these like lower class French prisoners escape. But it's a real discussion point even then. The film is based off of actual experiences in World War I. So I don't really study World War I, but I would suspect both from that and from the Dutch prisoners that you've mentioned, that it persists a lot longer than I think we would think of. It definitely sort of disappears in World War II, and you can see that because they've got more laws in place about human rights and protecting prisoners, and you see this shift toward this idea that, like, prisoners have a duty to attempt to escape, right? They're not using honor as their guiding light anymore.
Kelsey, thank you so much for joining us. It's excellent. We never had a chance to talk about prisoners of war in the Napoleonic period, and I really enjoyed that so much. So thank you.
Well, thank you for inviting me. It's been fun.
Don't forget that we do exist on Patreon as History Hack and on Patreon as well, which is Podbean's own version. Alina and I have had massive fun doing this in 2020, but life's going to change quite a lot next year and we're going to actually have to go and earn a living, etc. If we want to keep up the regularity that we've been bringing you and the kind of guests that we've been bringing you and the workload, then we will need your help. So if you join, there's going to be incentives for joining on either of those platforms. We're revamping ourselves on both of them. So don't forget to go in. You can do as little as $1 a month, and it all goes towards keeping up History Hack as regular as we've been able to bring it to you this year. We are now on YouTube. We are posting all of our new episodes on there, and we have our own channel, and we are gradually posting all of the back episodes because we have been made aware of the fact that you can only find the last 100 on some platforms. So you can go and listen to your heart's content and laugh at the cartoons and have a great time. So do go over there and subscribe.